everyone, it's Stephanie with a video from My Favorite Things. In today's video, I decided to create a really summery type card. I've been really inspired lately by all the flamingos and the greenery and everything I've been seeing in various designs kind of all over the place. And I really wanted to kind of translate that into a card design. So I'm going to create a really fun summery card. It's going to be a little bit busier than I normally create, but I had so much fun making it and I really like how it turned out. So to start off, we're going to do some inking on some white cardstock panels. Using an ink blending tool with distress inks onto a white cardstock panel is a really quick and easy way to add color and then be able to die cut from. So I'm not using any markers or any type of coloring mediums at all. I'm just doing some really quick inking and then we're going to die cut from all these pieces. So I'm using a mix of distress oxides and the regular distress inks, and if you can kind of tell when I'm adding the color here that the oxide inks are kind of chalky looking and really opaque, and the distress inks are a little bit more mellow. They're not as dark in color and they kind of have a more translucent look to them. So I really liked the idea of having the two different types of inks kind of combined on this card design. Now I normally just spray directly onto my pieces when I use distress inks to add distressing, but for these panels here I wanted the dots of color that we're kind of removing here to be really small. I didn't want them to be really large splotches, so I decided to just add some water to an acrylic block. And then I'm just using a paintbrush to kind of flick that water off onto the panels there, and it gives me a much smaller distress look rather than the big large splotches that I get using the actual water sprayer. So now that I have all the inking done and I have them all distressed, I went ahead and added all of the pieces from the Wild Greenery Die-namics as well as the Flamingo Die-namics to the pieces so that I could die cut everything. So now you can see I have all my different leaves there cut out, and then I have two different flamingos with all of the parts that kind of make the flamingo go together. So before we move on to the card design, I want to assemble all the flamingo parts. So I'm just using a liquid glue pen and I'm gluing on their beaks. They are really tiny, so it helps to have the liquid glue pen to do that. And then I'm adding their little wings here on with some foam adhesive just to give them a little bit of extra dimension. And then I also have their little legs there, which I cut out from steel gray cardstock, and I'm just adding those on with some liquid adhesive as well. I'm just kind of dabbing it onto the top of the leg since they are pretty tiny, and then I'm just positioning the flamingos directly on top and then pushing those on, and that's going to help to adhere those together. And then once I have all of my flamingos put together here, they're all done, I'm going to create a little bit of a background to add everything onto. So rather than just use a regular white card panel, I want to add a little bit of very subtle embossing. So I'm going to take the Garden Flourish background stamp and I'm adding some Versamark ink onto that stamp, and I'm not completely covering it. I don't want the entire panel covered with the design. I just kind of want an area in the bottom right corner of this panel to have this design. So I'm adding some Ranger Pearl embossing powder. This is the silver pearl, and when you heat emboss this onto white, it kind of gives it a look of like a silver pearl finish. It's really kind of like a metallic. It's beautiful and it's really subtle, but when you kind of tilt it in the light as I'm doing here, you can kind of see how shiny and pretty that is. So I just wanted to have that little bit of subtle detail in behind all of the stuff that we're going to add to the card. So now that I have the embossing done, I'm taking this to my die cutting machine with the largest Stitch Wonky rectangle die, and I'm going to die cut that to give it a nice finished edge. I really love the kind of crazy stitching around the outside edges. I think it really just kind of goes with this fun summary card that we're creating. So now I'm going to bring in one more detail. I did mention that this was going to be a little bit busier than normal, so I am adding lots of different elements, but I really feel like they come together in the end card design and work really well. So I'm taking the Polaroid, these are the Precious Polaroids, and I'm taking the two middle-sized frames from here. And my original plan was to have the flamingos look like they were actually in a Polaroid picture, but I realized when I put the flamingos together that they're kind of large and I would lose a lot of detail from them if I just kind of put them within the frame. So I decided to create the Polaroid frames and then just adhere the full flamingos directly on top of those. So what I've done is I've cut out two of the frames here, and I've also cut out a piece of cardstock to kind of position behind them. It's cut slightly smaller, and that's going to allow me to adhere the frame as well as the inside area onto that cardstock piece and make it one piece there for me to be able to adhere it to the card. So I'm taking some more Distress Oxide ink. This is the Broken China, and I'm using a very light hand and adding some of that color to the center area of the Polaroid to kind of look like sky. And then I'm taking a combination of my wet adhesive as well as my tape runner, and I'm adding adhesive to the back area of these Polaroids, and then I'm positioning everything onto those extra pieces of cardstock that I cut out there, and that's going to allow me to fully assemble the little picture frames here. Now, once I have them assembled, because I am going to be putting them directly onto this card panel that we created, and the frames are white around the outside edge, they kind of get lost in the background. So I'm taking a little bit of pumice stone distress ink and I'm adding it to the outside edges of these frames, just to give them a little bit of shadow and kind of make them stand out from the background. So you can kind of see there now when I positioned them onto the card that they stand out a little bit more than they did before I had that ink detail on the edges. So now I have all of the components ready to go. I can start to assemble the card. So I positioned the Polaroid frames exactly where I wanted them, and now I'm adhering these flamingos onto these frames. So I'm kind of putting them in place there so I can figure out exactly where I want to place them. And then I'm going to adhere the frames to the base as well. But before I do that, I want to add that largest leaf first because it is pretty large and it's going to be kind of hard to tuck under there. And then what I'm doing is I'm adding adhesive only to the center area of the two Polaroids. And what that's going to allow me to do is take all of these green leafy pieces that we've cut out, and I can easily add adhesive to the ends of them and tuck them underneath all of these frames. So I'm just quickly adding adhesive to all the ends of the pieces here, and then I'm just kind of lifting up the Polaroids and tucking them in there. And I'm not kind of going with any specific design, I'm just kind of filling up the area so that I have all of these different leaf patterns kind of coming out from behind all of the Polaroids. And some of them were a little bit too long, so I did take my scissors and just cut pieces of them off. That way I had less to kind of tuck underneath there, and it was a little bit easier to adhere them. And then for that one that I just added there, I kind of added it so that the leaf was overlapping the Polaroid just to make it look like one continuous design. So I'm just going to finish up here and add this last guy onto here, and then we have this complete panel with this really fun design that has these Polaroids with the flamingos as well as all the leaf pattern underneath. So to put the card together, now I'm just going to add the panel to a piece of gumdrop green cardstock. It's cut slightly larger than the panel just to have a really tiny border around that edge there. And then I'm going to adhere the entire finished panel to a top folding grout gray card base, which measures 5.5 by 4.25 inches. To finish it off, I'm going to use some Nouveau drops in ebony black to add eyes to the flamingos. And then I also added some clear sequins with some silver stickles in the centers to kind of fill in some of that white area that we had around the image. So now I have this really fun cluster with all these leaves, and then I also stamped a sentiment on the inside because I felt like the outside was a little bit too busy. So I left it on the inside and left the fun flamingo design on the outside. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I will see you next time.